Okay, I think we've waited long enough for everyone to join. Purdy will monitor the Q&A, and I think we are. So welcome everyone to all you need to know about Project Cortex, brought to you by Zilio and the rest of the Zilio team. And today's session, we are going to talk a bit about demystifying complex migrations. My name is Alistair Pugin, and I will be your captain for this voyage into the content services abyss. In this webinar series, we started this probably about 2 months, just under 2 months ago, when we started talking to other Microsoft experts. We talked to Microsoft engineering and product teams, specifically around what the future of Cortex is. And Simon was on one of these. Please note, if you have any questions, drop it in the Q&A window, and we will get Simon to answer them at the end. This webinar will also be recorded and uploaded to Zilio's YouTube channel, and we will also be providing attendees with a webinar recap covering the key take-home points of the session. If you do have Purdy saying that the Q&A window has not popped up because we've got a gremlin inside of Microsoft Teams. So if you do have a question, reach out to myself at Alistair Pugin on Twitter, and I think Simon is also on Twitter. So without any further ado, welcome Simon.
Hi Alistair, thanks for the intro. Yeah, I am also on Twitter too. I'm at BuildBod. You'll soon find me.
Yeah, that's right. That is right. Simon, we featured you before on the webinar series we did with Microsoft around just before the Microsoft Ignite this year. Just who are you? I mean, where do you stem from? I know it's been covered before, but for the audience that's dialed in today, and I'll still use the term dialed. I mean, that's what do people say today when you connect somewhere? I dialed in.
You still dialed in, yeah.
I don't know what people say today. Do people just are we connected, right? How does that work? But yes, who you are, where you're from, what brought you to this conversation piece today?
Sure, yeah. Hi, I'm Simon Denton. I'm the architect of all things Microsoft 365 at a company called Mott MacDonald. We specialise in consulting engineering, construction engineering, and connecting and creating opportunities through infrastructure. And I guess what's brought me to this conversation today is that yes, I've been involved in Project Cortex for quite a long time. Mott MacDonald a bit part of the preview program, and we featured in the launch. But what's brought me to the conversation today is Cortex is all about content and making suggestions based on the content that you have in SharePoint, but not all of your content is in SharePoint, or will ever be in SharePoint. And we are on a journey of migrating hundreds of terabytes of legacy content from old document management systems or systems we're retiring and file shares and the like. And we want to be able to start tapping into some of that latent knowledge and understanding. And whilst Project Cortex features in some of the reuse of that content, there's a whole exercise to do to at least get content into the right location. So I thought it'd be to share some of the journey that we've been through in terms of migrating a legacy DMS and some of our future work that we're looking at around file shares and other document management systems, and then dovetailing into how that fits into Microsoft Search and to Project Cortex and SharePoint Syntex and all the shiny new tools in the way. So yeah, that's what's brought me to the conversation today.
You know, I always ask customers that are working with what we like to call legacy ECM systems, what made you decide on going with Microsoft 365, more importantly, products like SharePoint? How did you get to that end where you were, okay, well, there's this thing called SharePoint, more importantly, there's this product in the suite of Microsoft 365 services called SharePoint Online, and how did you go about evaluating SharePoint Online to a point where you said, well, okay, let's pull the trigger. We're going to move our content sources or our content repositories to a product like SharePoint Online?
Yeah, so the journey we went through started about 5 years ago, and it was very much, well, if we wanted to embrace at the time Office 365, obviously before the rebrand, we wanted to embrace Office 365, and we wanted our to make the most of having the platform, more than just an email platform. And we saw that, as part of that, if you do have other document management systems, you end up with presenting your staff, your colleagues, your consumers with destination blindness. And so if you've got a legacy, you've got an existing document management system, which, don't get me wrong, is really good, but you've got a document management system, you've got file shares, you've got other ways of collaborating and getting work done. We went through a kind of journey of trying to rationalize down to reduce the amount of destination blindness. And through that rationalization process, we kind of settled on SharePoint Online, because with SharePoint, it's integral to the rest of the suite of tools. And so by consolidating to that point, rather than, say, consolidating to other pieces, we were going to get the best out of the entire suite, out of the entire platform. So that's why we took that journey. Yeah. So
it does make sense. Yeah, we could. It does make sense. And how did Microsoft go about? We know that knowledge management is now sexy again. I use the term light. It's the cool product. That was the year of the Yammer. Well, year of Yammer, not year of the Yammer. It's year of Yammer. And yeah. And Chris and team and Ian and Naomi and Rebecca have been spending the last 2 to 3 years talking about knowledge management. And we know in the SharePoint space, knowledge management is fairly new as a discipline, because SharePoint people come from they're either a developer and they need to work with SharePoint, or they were training in another product, or they have infrastructure, or they're DBA, right? Yeah. And this is the thing, right? Where people have now come from, and all of a sudden there's this thing called knowledge management, and AIM has changed things from ECM to content services, and Microsoft talks about these 4 disciplines that compromise, or not compromise, that comprises of knowledge management, not compromise. Geez, my English is not good today. Knowledge discovery, workplace insights, yeah. Experts and expertise and answers, which is really about tacit and codified knowledge, and then also content services. Was that your approach, or did you have a different approach when you looked at the terabytes of content? Yeah. And I liked your, what did you call it, content blindness?
Yeah, destination blindness.
Yeah, destination blindness. I talk about information methane and content black holes, right? Yeah. Because that's really where these content sources, or what they become, it's, nobody knows where it goes. It's just there, right? And how do we sort of transact with that information? Because it's like methane. It's just out there in the air, in the ether. So your approach, was it along their lines, or did you have a different approach to this blindness that you were talking about?
Yeah, the approach of blindness was just reduce the number of destinations down, right? Because you just end up with content proliferation, and the first point of call we look at is content management, and creating common data environments that allow people to get work done, to focus on the work in progress, to focus on what they're sharing, what's been published and what's been archived. And if you've got multiple destinations from which you're asking people to do that, and you're running thousands of projects per year, you have really no idea where your content's at. You can't reuse any tacit knowledge within that content. It's trapped in a system somewhere, and there's a good chance that you've got it. And also, you're supporting just a wider and wider array of systems that do very similar operations. I would say they're all content services platforms, and knowledge management is a pretty rigid sort of definition. It's using the word management, so it's knowledge management. And I think all of the platforms offer degrees of content services and content processing and content automation. The knowledge management bit is really what's happening now. That's coming on. So, our first goal is trying to get things, reduce the number of destinations, and get content into meaningful locations where we can then leverage additional tools upon that.
Now, What was your vision at the very beginning, right? I've had this conversation with you before around your content sources and your diagram that we're going to show everyone in a bit. How do you approach that? I mean, if you've got 6 or 7 different content sources, and I know in your case, you're the only people, well, you and a power company in Hong Kong are the only 2 people that I know that's actually used a data box or a data trolley, right? Yeah. I mean, you people just like indiscriminately swap them out all the time, which kind of scares me. It's like, here's one, give us another one. How do you approach that? I mean, for me, when I look at the size of your organization and the content, it's gargantuan, right? The amount of content you have and the content types you have, it's on different media sources and it's scattered. I think you use the word bunkers across the UK.
Yeah, you use squirrel storage, right? So yeah, and that's the thing. We've got a load of content destinations. So we've got document management systems, engineering content management systems, file shares are plenty. We've got what we call squirrel storage, which is affectionately USB drives, NAS drives, backups, tape backups that people mistakenly think are actually workable, usable content repositories, and we've got petabytes of the stuff there. Where in the office I work in Birmingham, and it's very similar to many of our offices, you can open a secure cupboard and you can look at 2 terabytes of like USBs and NAS drives and all sorts just in the cupboard, and some of it's petabyte scale. And we just end up with content just proliferating everywhere. And the approach was to take a step back. We've got to simplify it, because there's a danger that it becomes like the end scene of the Raiders of the Lost Ark. Right, you're just wheeling content into a dusty warehouse somewhere that you'll never be able to get back out, and you don't even know what's there. You don't know how to use it. So the first thing about demystifying migrations and moving things into SharePoint was take a step back, recognizing the fact we've got maybe 6 or 7 approved destinations at the time where people could store things and deliver projects and work from. And there's probably another 100 other destinations where they're putting things. So take a step back and see if we can come up with an agnostic way of drawing those destinations together, bringing that content through a pipeline, through a migration pipeline, and placing it in 1 or 2 repositories in such a way that we can repeat the process, we can do it at velocity, and we can then reuse and tap into latent knowledge. So yeah, I mean, I can quite happily take you through the sort of the planning if you like.
Yes, I saw that diagram the last time, and if you can put it up, and we can actually look at that, that'll be great.
Sure, yeah. So let's do the classic Teams thing, right? So yeah, my screen should be up, which is good. So what it kind of all boiled down to was migration is a mapping problem. Yeah. You've got different locations and different sources of information, and you've got to map those into a controlled way and work out what you're going to keep and what you're going to hold. And so I'm not going to run through all the words, but I'm more than happy to share sort of some of the things that we kind of faced. But some of the things we faced was content volume. If we take our legacy DMS, it's about 300 terabytes. We take the squirrel stores, there's petabytes of content. And be able to do any sort of migration and disposition at scale and at velocity is quite a big challenge to go through. And it's one that if you can disappear into a bit of an Alice in Wonderland moment, right, about how to do it and how to go through it. And suddenly you're looking at a roadmap which is like 6 years of moving terabytes of content. So some of that, some of the challenges around volume and velocity. People are used to, especially when they're using document management systems, whatever you do in terms of migration, so you're moving the content to SharePoint or you're moving it to an Azure file storage or somewhere else. The thing that we found that people hung on to was the comparable search experience. I used to be able to search for this like this. I want to be able to search things like that. So we had to find ways of addressing search. And one of the big areas that can really overcomplicate a migration or add additional complexity, depending on your perspective, is things like versioning and permissions and security. Some of this content that we're migrating, the people who created that content are no longer with us at the organization, right? And the permissions and security around that, and the groups that have been set up to access it, all of that is sort of additional permissional baggage that you kind of need to either decide you process and you try and take that into your new repositories, or in our case, to simplify it, we just drew a line and said, we're going to make sure we have a content owner. We make sure the content owner's got the right permissions to access it, and we're going to hit reset on the permissions and start reducing some of the challenges around migration of permissions. There's some other things. Emails are really difficult. You've got emails sat in other platforms, and then you try to bring them into other platforms. You try extracting things like header information, the from, the to, and sort of information like that. And I guess some of the other challenges are around projects that are live. So you've got a legacy document management system, you've got a file share you're trying to migrate, and people are trying to work on that, right? So you're already starting to think about deltas. So I think these are the typical challenges that we face, and I guess many sort of customers face when they're looking at migrations. And also the final point around challenges, this wasn't a journey that was a bed of roses, right? So we found that there are actually things around your infrastructure that becomes incredibly challenging, right down to the wire that connects the SFP on the storage device to a server, right? That could be a bottleneck. So we do find that these are some of our challenges. And what the process
I like what you mentioned there, knowing what is a record and what is not. That's when does a document become a record? And I spoke to one of our government departments probably about 10 years ago, and they do archiving. And they wanted to know from me, when does a document become a record? I said, well, that's based on the document type or the classification schema, and they didn't know either. So for me, when you put that down, I'm glad to see that people still think the same way. It's difficult if you don't have a records team and a records officer and some supervisors that are doing your classification and categorization and understand the file plan. I mean, file plan descriptors are all the rage right now because there's records management in SharePoint, but it's always been inside of your documentums and your live links. And you really need people in your organization that understand what a record is. So when you classify a document to record and what happens, people interchange the word disposal with disposition. And it's two totally different things. So yeah, it's interesting to see that you struggled with identifying a record or declaring a record, a document a record. So that's good to see that I'm not alone in this journey.
You're not, and to be honest, you put two legal counsels in a room and ask them to tell you what is a record and what's not, and you'll get two opposing views. And actually, the view that we took was everything's a record, right? So everything that's been done, everything that's been touched is a record of an action, right? And you kind of see that through the principles, because else you go on a really hard journey about, okay, this is a record, this is not. I need this person to look at it. This person needs to make a decision. We need this process, and you need to start ramping up complexity. So we took a little bit of a hoarders approach, which was, okay, it's project related, it's going to be a record. I'm not going to read through all of these, but I just want to kind of call out a couple of points, right? So we had some core principles were established. We would establish a chain of custody. This is very much like evidential work. If you're moving or migrating content, you want to be able to form a chain of custody. You want to be able to record all the actions upon it, because we'll just see in a minute, sometimes simple things like file name lengths, you can't tolerate those in destination systems. You need to make adjustments. And you just know that in 13 years' time, when an auditor comes along and says, tell me what happened to this file, who touched it, why is it called this now? You need to be able to go back and kind of prove that. So we built some principles around having, establishing a chain of custody. We built some principles around who owns the content. We didn't want content being sucked back from archives in bulk, because you just end up in a vicious circle. You archive a project, then come to the next project, and they suck all that content back out of archive, attach it to a new project, and now you're sort of doubling your content. And to put that in perspective, our legacy document management system, it took nearly 10 years to put 300 terabytes of content into it. It's taken us less than 3 years to put the same amount into SharePoint Online without migrating the content. This loop and content generation and new content generation is a really sort of
wow.
Big cycle to kind of go through. We also went through an exercise of kind of defining what we mean by archive. You know, to your point, Alistair, you know, it's not knowledge management actually. This is about migration of content and putting it in the right destinations. It's not backup, it's not preservation, you know, it's not those terms. And we needed some key states in which to do it. So we kind of set those principles up, and then we kind of settled on our objectives, which is low effort, high accuracy methodology for velocity migrations from multiple sources and standardized destinations. So the idea being, develop a system we can hoover as much content as we can up through various connectors and processes into a standardized pipeline in the way so it's all treated the same way, and then we could store it, reuse it, and repurpose it. And from that, we came up with some higher, you know, higher principles around that. You know, this is the edited highlights, you know, things like no loss of records. We've got to maintain this sort of chain of custody. So, and we will do some content filtering, you know, just to avoid a little bit of garbage out of one system and garbage into a new system, right? So thumbs.db files are pretty good for garbage, right? And they're easy ones to get rid of. And actually, when it comes to doing migrations, it's not really the file, we found it's not really the file volume that's the kicker. Yeah, okay. You're trying to move a 2 GB plus file, and that's going to take time. But what's the kicker in the migration process is the number of writes, reads and writes that you're doing from one system to another, right? If you just try now on your computer, obviously if you want to listen to me now, but save a file to your C drive on documents and time how long that takes, right? That's not a moment, right? I mean, if you've got millions of these files and they take a couple of seconds each, that is actually going to be a constraining factor in your migration process. It's not the size of the file, it's the fact that you've got to do millions of these little writes. So if you can strip out some of the tiny little files that is effective, you could certainly speed up your migration process and simplify it as part of the point of view. So
just a quick one before you carry on. If you need to ask us a question, I will monitor the Twitter feed. You can find me at Alistair Pugin. I will also monitor Simon at BuildBod. Yeah. If you have any questions. And Tiffany, thank you for watching. We really appreciate you being in the audience.
So yeah, thank you. So what I kind of sort of boiled down to was that this is the sort of the highest level. We had a number of content sources that we wanted to plug in through a series of connectors. These, I guess, is the bespoke element. Like a document management system is going to have a specific API within which you can talk to a document management system. File shares are sort of less particular, and there's tooling like Azure Import to do it. But you might have another service, you know, like a tape drive or something that needed another API. So it came up with an ingestion process that was built on having a number of connectors that will process the content coming through, and a common migration and orchestration service. That common migration orchestration service would then save inactive content down to Azure Blob, and we could tier that off as we need. And the live content that we determine based on our rules would be moved to SharePoint. Now, this is, I guess, this box is where your mileage varies, and so we decided on the fact that we would go fairly hands-on in terms of our migration and sort of the orchestration process. But there are plenty of migration vendors out there that will tackle this black box sort of for you, and it depends on really on what skill sets are available to your organisation. But I wanted to go fairly hands-on, and I wanted to be able to do this and be able to deliver this as an ongoing service that we can attach to other content repositories. To that end, I think all migration orchestration needs something sat on the front. So we use a bit of Azure Search to give us a simplistic search experience. Quite a lot of SQL involved, or Cosmos DB if it's, you know, we're going upscale, and some workflow reporting from end. So that's the idea of the sort of migration service. The idea being that we'd underpin it with some security and logging. But so with that sort of concept in mind, the simplification and the sort of demystifying process was then boil down into this. Now, this is not a plate of spaghetti, and I don't want it to be sort of overwhelming in the sort of view, but you've got a series of connectors that are bringing content in from different repositories, using a common archiving service. Now, the tooling that we chose was pretty hands-on, but if you look at some of the higher-end migration services, they will cover some of these things for us. And we had some principles about tearing the inactive down, then moving the content out to active locations, and ultimately taking advantage of it. So if I thought I'd just kind of run you through this, Alistair, if you think that we would help people. So
yeah, it's magic.
Yeah, so if we just kind of follow this thread down, so we've got a lot of legacy document management system now, and they're typically made up of two sort of core components, right? One is its audit and structure and the database side of it, and its file storage, where the files are actually stored. We had to determine a way to pull that content out, and that's actually where we needed a specialist sort of connector to do that, to pull that content out through. And as part of the decision-making process, in terms of reducing the time taken to do it, we did go through the process of actually did this service need dedicated front ends that the migration API could talk to, rather than impacting users who were working on the using the service at the time. And actually, as it turned out, we didn't really need the migration front ends. But what we did go down was we started pushing terabytes of content over the wire through this process. And the DMS was hosted in our data center in the UK, nice big data center connection to the internet and beyond. We were saturating that quite comfortably, and we were not getting the speeds, and we could see that the sort of project just sort of never completing, because I think this is still organizational content. This is not content like your Xbox update that you click and 500 gig downloads just like that, and the game's available in 6 or 7 minutes. Because this content needs to be verified, replicated, and so on, it does take a long time to do it. So we did move to a lift and shift approach. We identify content that's on the back-end storage systems. We move that onto a data box. We ship that up to the cloud, to our ingestion engine, and then we start the processing going there. We sent the data box back, we grabbed the next lot, came back, and in the course of a couple of weeks, we had lifted all of the 300 sort of terabytes of content and got it to a staging area. And what the staging area was designed to do was to do some of the things about getting the content within the sort of a common framework and structure. We would sit it in the temporary sort of extraction area. We'd scan it for malicious content and malware. So, content like this has been added to, say, DMS or a file share over 10 or 12 years. And so at the time, exploits which may not have been known about may have been dropped into the document management system. And the moment they're sort of available for a member of staff to download again as a file again, they might explode. But you do hope that things like Windows Defender would have caught up and understood it. But we thought it'd be sort of a double belt and braces approach to scan all the content that's coming in, just to make sure there's nothing malicious coming in. I guess the last thing we want is our entire archive crypto lockered, right? At that point, we're trying to capture sort of the key content, so the key metadata. So there's a common schema around all of the content that you're sort of ingesting. It's got a title, it's got a last modified date. Less so a person, because some systems don't even capture who did the editing. Like if you don't have the auditing set on Windows Server properly, you just know date and file name. So we had a common schema of things that we know would pick up from any of these sources, and for each source we have a specific schema, and that schema will be stored within SQL. So then we could start building out search and metadata for reuse and discovery. And at the time we brought things in, we would assign a unique ID. If we bring it from a DMS, it's quite often there's an original source ID, and using that is fine. But like a chain of custody, and it's like just signing the bag, put the file in the bag, sign the bag, and you've got a unique ID for it. That way you can trace what's happened all the way through the service, and that's kind of keeps the auditors happy. But that allowed us also to do some comparisons to make sure that when we lifted the files up, there hadn't been any loss of integrity. So we could cross-check, we'll say, with an MD5 sort of hash. Each bit of content will go through a transformation process because we know that the destinations that the content are going to may or may not accept certain things. So blob storage is pretty unforgiving. I mean, pretty forgiving. You know, you can have invalid characters, you can have all sorts of information, you just dump it in there, right? But some of this content was destined for SharePoint. SharePoint is less forgiving, and I think for a really good reason. That SharePoint has a character limit, and our staff, why are we cutting file names down? And it's because of good discipline, really. I think legacy document management systems allow you to give a file name, basically the chapter of a book as its length, is not good. Right?
The day someone came along and chopped a hole in a wall, and that's why we had to create this document .x, right?
I mean, yeah. Doc, and then they converted .docx, right? .pdf when they had, and they become why they chapter and verse. And the other part of it is that things like folders are really good substitutes for metadata, and we saw people doing that as a process too. And sometimes they'll bake metadata into the title, like version 1 and the date and some of this other information that we had. So we would strip out some of the invalid characters to make sure that worked. Yes, there was a trade-off. Related files that have got hard-coded links with them are going to start breaking at a point, because typically a hard-coded link will have the full name. Hence, we'd capture all that in our information repository, so we can look back at it. We'd do some PII scanning, which we'd actually use search for. A little bit of deduplication, really, let's get rid of the thumbs DB stuff and some of the other stuff, and let's reduce it. And I guess the next sort of key point was to start creating that searchable index based on the content that was presented through the pipeline. So providing a searchable index had two reasons. One is we didn't want people just mindless, just re-downloading content from the archive and adding it to a live system, and then we ultimately re-ingest that content again, and we start doubling, tripling, quadrupling the size of our archive. And if we could create a searchable index which gives them sufficient results that actually they know enough from that content that they don't actually need to download it, I think we've saved ourselves a future re-ingestion of content. We also created a searchable index because we observed there's effectively going to be two search patterns at play. One is the search pattern, I knew where the content was, so therefore can I navigate to where the content was? And we would replicate that through our search interface. But then as memories kind of fade a bit and different people get involved, then you start getting people going, right, I need the stuff about the big bridge project. Yeah. Asterisk. Hit search, right?
Yeah, it's what is it? It's navigation-based search or idea-based search, right? Or concept-based search. And those are the two things.
And I think there's about there's about 6 months where people were more likely to look for things based on navigation. Then after that point, once the memory sort of kind of fades, they start to look on search. So we created a searchable index, and then we tier it off. All that content off to blob storage for all the inactive content, and we can put some lifecycle management around that and start working that down. That has another advantage, that whilst it's sat in blob, and yes, we have created a searchable index. Perhaps I should talk about searchable indexes another time because it's quite a lot to go into. But it does mean that at a later date, we can then rerun AI and ML over that historical information without bringing it into a higher cost service like SharePoint to run the sort of story. So it can be reprocessed because it's in a structured storage system. It's stored at the cheapest here. It's fractions of the cost of the storage that's been used for the document management system, and all that great information we would store in a master data model with some mapping tables and some logging. As I say, if you use sort of the higher end migration tooling services, this is what a lot of the stuff happens under the hood, right? Just some of the stuff that they do in this kind of work paid for. And then sort of the next stage is where around what I term the rehydration content. So we've taken it in, we've cleaned it up, we've created an index, we've worked out where it is, we've stored it off. But some of this content is destined for either reuse or it's still live content that people are working on. So we had a number of live projects. We're filtering them through this pipeline. We spit them out the other end, and they're in a SharePoint project site. So by plugging the other end of the migration engine, which effectively almost running the system in reverse, we start rehydrating out using connectors to SharePoint to place the team of project content. And that actually, in terms of the whole process, is by far the slowest part of a migration from a document management system. Getting the content up, pretty good. You can do some pretty nifty lift and shift, and you can do that quite quickly. Getting the content to SharePoint, you really are beholden to API rate limits. And there's only so many user accounts and so many machines and so many connectors you can set up to start pushing content into SharePoint. Pushing to SharePoint, if it's OneDrive destination content, so where people have personal workspaces in these systems, we push it to that OneDrive. Again, just create a connector. Storage, and you see the Exchange. Exchange is another really hard one. If to reduce the complexity around that, we opted to simply save the message files into SharePoint in this situation, rather than trying to strip out the from, the to, the subjects, because actually all that needs to be passed back through Outlook for all that good stuff to be exchanged. So we're actually doing that sort of extraction for a slow time, and the idea being that we can start bolting on other connectors.
Yeah.
And I guess that what it allows us to do then is to start taking advantage of some of the knowledge discovery and reuse services within SharePoint. We've put the good content that we want, that it's active, and we reuse. If you plug SharePoint into SharePoint Syntex, you've suddenly got a great suggestions engine around that content that you've brought in. You've also supercharged your search in terms of that content you brought in, because SharePoint is going to start indexing and bring that information through. With the connectors through Microsoft Search, plugging into file stores, hopefully in time emails and things like that, you can start getting a greater picture and around the reuse and discovery. And so we sort of operate this as a pipeline, and the final sort of part of that puzzle, if I kind of zoom out, is the fact that a lot of this is sat effectively, if you're a data scientist, in a data factory. There is a data model, there's some data ingestion, you've got some mapping tables, you've got some logging and telemetry, and these are actually the Azure products that we are using to do this. It kind of shows you can achieve a lot of this near enough out of the box. I would say the orchestration bit, you do need to write some code to write some orchestration, but you can start using the out-of-box tooling. So we can get people, they can come and perform a search, they can check permissions to see that they've got it. They can submit requests, they can get the content from the archives and browse it. We can give some Power BI reporting in terms of the velocity of our migrations, where content is, how much content is, who owns it, when it should be retired, when it should be tiered down. And also one of the other sort of features which allow the mapping tables help, and the fact that we've got a chain of custody involved, is we can start redirecting people to where their content has gone to. If you click on a link that's in a document in a legacy system, you don't really want to go to a 404 not found page, right? You want to be able to actually find where that thing's gone to, so you can actually start putting a link redirecting process. But by simplifying the process and breaking it out into a series of chunks, and doing a simple thing like indexing before you transfer to blobs to avoid your access charges around it, putting some things in way, some rules in place, like reducing permissions. Let's make it as simple as possible. That sort of simplifies the migration process. So that is a quick whirlwind run through the sort of our migration block diagram. It really helped us simplify the process.
So everyone just needs to follow your diagram, and they'll be able to move their legacy ECM systems to the Microsoft clouds, right? Spreading it across Azure, pulling it into SharePoint Online, and then running through the content understanding, processing, and compliance engines of Cortex / Syntex. And actually building these knowledge, well, these expertise and answers. I know that topic cards or topics are still coming, but have you done a lot of content understanding and processing, content processing around that content that you're going to be pulling into SharePoint?
Yeah, so we've started looking at the content we've been bringing in. One example is we're bringing in on a particular project, bringing in lots of inspection records. And typically when you take a new asset on and you're given the inspection records for the past 10 years, 20 years, however long that bridge, that station, that airport has been in existence for. And the first thing you want to do is kind of appraise how that asset has performed, how it's been treated, any sort of risk points. You've got to go through that review. And what we've been looking at and using the Syntex elements and some elements from Cortex to look at is, can we reduce the amount of time that an engineer has spent reading through detailed inspections? I'm not saying that they don't need to read through detailed inspections, but what is an expensive process is initially you sit them, they'll sit down for a couple of weeks potentially looking through all these things and basically piling them out, going, actually, this is about the foundations, this is about the superstructure, this is about, and moving it out. And then what the content processing allows us to do is to look at automating at least the placing of some of that information in buckets and capturing some of the key metadata. What is the drawing number that's talking about this? So we can abstract that from using the content processing. What's the title? What's the keyword? And start pulling that information out and putting it in a meaningful list that someone can then start searching through and go, actually, okay, I need to be thinking about the superstructure, I need to be thinking about this peer, and we've been able to pull out that information into a SharePoint list. They can start filtering and refining through that. So we've been looking at that through a series of experiments, and I think it's fair to say those experiments will be ongoing for a little while longer.
That makes a lot of sense, Simon. And I think for me, the take home for me is really following quite a regimented process in your diagram. I mean, you've simplified it down to these are the steps. This is how we qualified the content. These are the sources where we actually want to take it to so that we can do some content cleansing, so that we understand what is topical, what is not topical, what is real, what is not real, and then pulling it through some sort of identifier so that we can actually classify the cleansed content so that it would get to its final resting place for consumption by users. Yeah, and a lot of this is, as I say, depending on your mileage, a lot of this is possible near enough out of the box. And if you haven't, to give an idea of, about the team behind the actual doing of this. So we have two developers who looked at the orchestration part of it, the sort of connector design, and one of which doubled up as the infrastructure guy who also looked at how do we lift and shift some of that content. Beyond that near enough is the core team that's sort of doing it. We've got some business people, who liaising with the business and communicating and all those good things. But actually, the core team, the actual people who are doing things day to day, is developer plus one. That's sort of running the process through. It needed to be hard. I think the hard bit is actually the communicating with the business in terms of this is happening now. We need to do it now. It's going to move. That part. That part can be quite time. Well, operational change, right? Through the transitional management or transition management is always the tricky part, because that's where we touch the human, right? We tell a hard drive, copy this data, and the hard drive says, thank you very much. I'll take it as fast as you can give it. I will process it and I'll stick it there. You can't tell a human to do that, because they, like a 2-year-old, will always ask you, but why? Why should I do this, right? Why can I not put my hand on the stove? Well, do it once and you'll understand why. But those are the things. So I'd love to spend more time with you talking about this, but we've reached almost the top of the 45 minutes dedicated to this webinar.
Yeah.
I've got two more questions for you. Are you still involved in Cortex and Syntex, or are
Yeah.
you still actively participating and helping the team?
Yes, I sure am. Yeah. Yeah.
So it's exciting times. I know there's a few more things coming out of. Syntex is the first product from the Project Cortex team, and I'm super excited to see what Microsoft has left. Last question for you: what's your favorite M365 feature?
My favorite feature.
Yeah.
I think my favorite feature is in my analytics the ability to block out my calendar and create focus time. That is by far my favorite feature. Oh, obviously I should say Yammer or something else, but that is defensive calendaring has become the new norm.
Defensive calendaring.
Yeah, I mean, you can lose your entire productive week to back-to-back meetings, and so I love it. My analytics, booking out focus time, automatic do not disturb, brilliant. I can actually get work done.
Okay, defensive calendaring. I'm going to write that down and talk about it. Well, Simon, thank you for your time. We really appreciate the work that you guys have done around building up, because this is a model. This is a migration model, right? I mean, you've used Zilio to do some sort of logical mapping, which is great to see. There's mention of ShareGate as well for the smaller stuff. And I'm excited to sort of peek over your shoulder every so often just to see where you're going. Last thing, how much content in a number? So I just want to give the audience a number when we start talking about content.
So this engine is currently processing 300 terabytes. It's near it. So yeah, 300 terabytes at the moment. It's nearly job done. I've got another 2 petabytes queued up for 2021.
There we go.
Beyond that, I'm opening the Squirrel stores and it's ready as the last start time, right?
All right. Well, thank you very much, Simon. If you need to get hold of Simon, you can find him on Twitter @BuildBod. And thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. If you'd like to know a bit more about legacy ECM migrations and how to make that easy, please reach out to myself @AlistairPugin or @Zilio on Twitter or on LinkedIn, and I'm sure someone will be happy to chat to you a bit more about what Zilio does and how they are migrating content out of legacy ECM systems into SharePoint Online. We'll catch everyone soon. Ciao, ciao.